Hello, Empire. Garrett here. This week's episode of Regent Corner. So today, let me get more light here. There we go. Today, what we're going to talk about is how to case leather. So, casing leather basically is a fancy way of saying we're going to soften the leather. And the reason why you do this is how you stamp, carve, and make design. We're going to be doing this here in a second, just as an example. Leather. Now, there's a couple different ways to do it. Traditionally, which you'll see in a lot of books, is the old dunk. There's basically what I call full casing and partial casing. Full casing is what you typically will see in leather working books and manuals and such, where they have you soak it in a tub or a bucket or the sink, and you basically hold it in the water until all the bubbles are gone, and then you take it out and let it dry. That's extremely excessive. The only time and that's what I call, and then you put that, and then you put it in a Ziploc bag, let it sit overnight, and then take it out the next day. Personally, I think that's extreme overkill, and frankly, a little bit counterproductive. For carving, it turns the leather kind of mushy. So unless I was doing something really thick and heavy, like saddle skirt here, then maybe if I was going to carve in the saddle skirt, because it's so thick and so dense, you would want to do it on something like that. But a normal piece of good 8 to 10 ounce leather that we're going to carve or thinner, you don't need to do that. That's just way too much. For example, I have a piece here that has been fully kind of soaked, and I'm just letting it dry. Or if I was going to wet mold a piece of leather, then I would soak it like that and let it sit overnight. Most of the time, what I'm going to do is my partial casing. I got my little bottle of water here. You just take a sponge. I cut a piece of sponge out. You get it nice and wet. And then what we're going to do here, it's a little excessive, but as you see the water absorbing, this is very much just like we did with the oil video and leather dye. You're just going to keep wetting it in little bits until it absorbs in there. And when you stop seeing it absorb, let me get it on the video there. Now, normally I would do the entire piece. I like to do the whole piece because you never know how the leather is going to react. If you're you don't want dark spots, light spots. So if I have a piece, I usually soak the entire piece. I wet it all down. And this is what I call partial casing, which means I'm just going to get this. That's probably plenty wet enough for this endeavor. So now here comes the fun part. You got to let it dry. How much you let it dry? Well, there's the question. So you want the leather to return back to, it should be cold to the touch and almost looks like it dry again. So as you see here, this is starting to get there. It's probably a little thin. You don't want to jump into it right away, but let's go ahead and experiment here. So the way you're going to know, let's just take my thing. Yeah, it's a little wet. Still a little wet. It feels mushy. You shouldn't feel any resistance and really any drag in your blade. But like I said, we're kind of rushing this a little bit for the video. I should have set that up sooner. But as you see, kind of like right here, I hope that translates well in the video. But it's starting to look like it's kind of starting to dry out almost. And that's kind of what we're going to go for. That's what you want to see is on that. Because I bet I could stamp that really easily. Let's see, what stamp do I want to use? Yeah, what the heck. We'll use, you know what, actually, I'll use my dragon stamp here. So we're going to take our hammer. And I'm just going to do this just for the point of video. So one good stamp. So we got a pretty decent stamp there, and that's how that's drying. This is starting to get better here. So typically after I case it like this, you want to give it 10, 15 minutes, and then and such. Now, another little pro tip I'll give you is, let's say you're doing a big project and you're working on it, or you're just working on it and you run out of time. You got, kids, gotta go late, you gotta get to school, whatever, right? So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and re-wet it real quick, and I'll put it in a Ziploc bag, set it off to the side, typically in the fridge or something, and that'll hold that moisture in the leather. This is really important because if I start carving, you don't want to stop in the middle of it, come back, let it all dry out, and then re-wet it, because when you do that, the leather is going to get drier because it's the moisture is going to dry it out. And then you're going to, let's see if this is ready to go. Oh, let me put this on video so you guys can. I'm probably going to do my carving video next week. Yeah, that's better. Starting to feel it. Could use a little bit. Now, personally, there comes a point of personal taste of how wet or dry you want the leather. But I can tell you this much. If you're pressing on it and you're cutting, or you're hitting the stamp and you see moisture or water coming out, it is entirely too wet. Don't ask me how I know that. Yeah, I have no problem throwing out my own shortcomings and mistakes on these videos. Trust me, you'll know. You're putting in the press in, you're stamping the stamp, and then all of a sudden you'll have you'll see the moisture, and it'll feel really mushy. And especially when you go to do your beveling, your bevels, you want the leather actually more dry when you go to bevel than wet, because that way there you're not pushing your leather out. Let me see. Let me do a quick. I don't know how this is going to translate onto video when I go to do my next one. May have to change the camera angle. All right, so I'm just going to do that real quick so we can show you how, and we'll get into beveling and this and that. But when I drop it in there and I start hitting my bevels, let me do it this way so you guys can see the video. Okay, that's a good example. Hopefully that you see this on the video. But that right there where the leather's pushing out, that leather's still too wet. And I'm obviously doing this on purpose. But this is to show you, see how it's rounding right there. It shouldn't be rounded. It should be nice and sharp. So that's just telling me this leather's too, lets you know it's too wet. Now here's a pretty good example. You see how it's starting to get a little bit lighter in the center here versus the rest. This is probably where we want. That's about where I usually do my leather work. Let's just make a couple of quick lines. Oh yeah, butter. You should not feel, if anything, just slight resistance. And anytime it starts getting too dry for your taste, you just take the sponge back over it, re-wet it a little bit, wait a minute, let it absorb, and then go back to it. Let's see. I know this isn't going to be as pretty as it could be. Just kind of rushing things here a little bit. But now you see, oh man, see how much better that crisper that line is compared to that mushy line. So that tells you, see, that's wet leather's too wet. This one, that's pretty good. That's what we want, a nice clean line. Now, obviously, I'd go back and clean this up, but that's another video. I might do that for next week's video. Stamping. Well, I'll tell you what. Give me some feedback here. You want a video on stamping and beveling, or do you want to go ahead and jump into carving? But anyways, so as I was stating before, we want that nice straight line. That line should be solid. It shouldn't be getting mushy. So when I go to do my beveling, You're better off letting the leather get even drier. I'm not gonna say the drier the better, but definitely on on the dry side. And that's so you get that nice crisp line there, so it doesn't start folding the line in and crushing the line like it did over here. Because this leather's still too wet, I can promise you that. But as you probably see, so you can oh gosh, I gotta get better light in here. But you can see the edges are just starting to roll a little bit better than up here. So the leather is drying. This would probably be good for carving and even stamping at this point. And as you see the kind of the fade here, so this would be a really good spot. And like here, you see the leather returning close to its natural color. And that's what we would call, and that's plenty perfect for what we need to do for carving and cutting and such. And then, as you see here, I'm hoping this is all in video. I know this isn't translating really well. I don't have the best video lighting. But as you can see, that line cuts really nice and smooth. It was nice and even. There was very little resistance. And that's what we want to see. Just a nice, firm piece of leather to carve into. And then from here, like I said, if it starts to feel too dry or you're getting too much drag and too much resistance, just wipe it down a little bit. You don't have to go as much as you did at first when you first cased it. You don't need to add a ton of water. Like I'll just do just a quick wipe like that. Let it get there, and then as you can see, it's already starting to lighten. And I'm just gonna let that give it another minute. Let it soften up, and then I'll go back and I'll carve it. Then we got up here's looking really nice. And so now if I'm wet molding or I'm using, then I'll absolutely use the full case method, which is the more traditional style. You dunk it in a tank of water, typically a sink or a bucket, and you hold it underwater until all it stops bubbling. And then you stick it in, like I said, you stick it in a Ziploc bag overnight, and you pull it out the next day. And even then, you have to let it dry if you're going to carve it. If I'm going to do it into a piece of really heavy saddle skirt, which I don't normally carve into my saddle skirt because it is so, the stuff is so thick and stiff, that if I were to, that's what I would use full casing for. But even then, you have to wait, gosh, hours for it to soften up enough. So just by doing that a nice there, this is about maybe 10-15 minutes. Yeah, we're 14 minutes in. So, and now that's getting even drier. And I bet if we were to do this, and so once again there, you see that nice clean line. It's not mushing, it's not smushing into the line. It's nice and even. And then I usually come back, and then I'll come back with a spoon, and we'll just give that a little there. Get rid of all those tool marks, because I'm not the best at it, but, and so that's why we want the leather to dry out. Better dry. And so, if nothing else, that is how I case my leather. And trust me, if I took, let me take a piece. So just show you real quick, this piece is completely dry. Nothing, no water whatsoever. If I were to try to carve this, it would be very shallow. See how shallow those cuts are compared to that cut where it's nice and much deeper. And then let's just, once again, just for example, here, I'll use a really small stamp that should normally, so you don't get a lot of detail, you're not getting a lot of pressure versus much better depth, much better shape on that. So that's why you want to case your leather, you want to wet the leather. Otherwise you don't get very good results, and you're gonna have a heck of a time trying to get anything done with your leather. So, and that's what I have for this week. Thank you very much for listening, and like I said, let me know what you want to see next week. You want to see a stamping, or just go ahead and jump straight into carving. And then until next time, stay crafty.